Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because what better way to start the week than with a strong Bitcoin rally above 70,000. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Bitcoin's clean close above the 7-month trend line was likely the start of a new chapter. Last week, we talked about how the weekly candle looked like a very clean bullish retest, which likely meant Bitcoin would grind higher. And now we have Bitcoin facing its last major resistance level at our range high. We still have quite a way to go before the weekly close, so a lot can happen. So all we can do for now is patiently enjoy this Bitcoin rally and hope that we see a close above this range high by the end of the week and we can see Bitcoin enter true price discovery. Now, you guys know that I like to get a little bit more cautious and conservative when we see a ton of bullishness start to seep into the market. We're seeing a lot of investors betting on 80K Bitcoin by election day, which somehow is under 7 days away already. And we've monitored Trump slowly pulling away on Polymarket. And although I know there's a lot of people who don't trust Polymarket, I don't think we can argue that the crypto industry looks at it very closely. And ever since we've seen Trump begin to pull away, we've seen Bitcoin's price slowly grind higher and higher. And it wouldn't surprise me if we rallied into the election as a major take profit event that everybody tries to front run now that the odds of Trump winning are so high based on Polymarket. It's also a bit concerning how much open interest we're seeing. If we look at the open interest, it's now well above the highs we saw in March, even though Bitcoin still hasn't made an all-time high yet. And this doesn't mean that price has to reverse immediately, but what it does mean is there's a higher and higher incentive for market makers eventually to liquidate all of that open interest. And it likely means that we're going to see an insane amount of volatility over the next few weeks as that open interest gets wiped out in both directions. And this aligns very nicely with Bitcoin's Q4 seasonality that we've talked about for quite a while now. Bitcoin has never had a boring Q4. October is almost always green, but the big moves tend to happen in November. And with the Fed starting to embark on rate cuts and so much drama being put around the election, around inflation data, and around the labor market, it looks like this year is going to be just like all those previous years where the big moves are going to happen in November, whether it's to the upside or the downside, especially after we've seen so much open interest build up over the past few months or so, and we're entering that very volatile period. We've talked about it many times in this channel going all the way back to 2015. October is usually green, but November is where the big move happens and decides the trend for that Q4. We saw that in 2015, saw it in 2016, saw it in 2017, all of which were to the upside. In 2018, we saw a green October, but a red November. Same thing in 2019. In 2020, November was green, so the entirety of Q4 was green. And then in 2021, it was green October, red November. Same thing in 2022. Last year was green October and green November, which ended up with a green Q4. And this year, we're waiting to find out if November is going to be red or green. It looks like it's going to be green based on what's happening with the election and the Fed reducing their rates. But of course, anything can happen, especially when there's this much open interest to wipe out. And every time I talk about this chart, I see all the comments of why, because this is a halving year, it has to be green. But that argument ignores what happened last year in the pre-halving year, because in the previous cycle, the pre-halving year had a red November, whereas last year we had a green one. And although I still think it's likely this November will be green, we have to be open to the fact that it could be red also, even if it's a halving year, because we saw this cycle's pre-halving year be green while the previous one was red. So there can be some variance in those outcomes. And speaking of variance in outcomes, Bitcoin looks like it's going to be following the short cycle or the easy cycle scenarios, depending on whether or not we see the Fed step in and start doing QE to stimulate the economy. The big drop scenario is still a possibility between now and when QE starts, but if we see Bitcoin enter price discovery, that momentum is probably going to be very strong and likely leads to one of these two outcomes. Of course, we'll continue to monitor it as we go along, and there's always a chance that we could see some type of bad recession in the first half of 2025. So we'll continue to closely monitor the economic data. But as of right now, it looks like the two most likely scenarios are the shortened cycle scenario or the easy cycle, depending on what we see the Fed doing over the next few weeks to months. And it's quite impressive that Bitcoin has been able to grind higher over the past few weeks, even with global liquidity going down. But I do think we're going to need to see global liquidity go higher for Bitcoin to go on one of those insane rallies like the one we saw in 2021 or in 2017. And that's likely going to require a big drop in the US dollar index. I mean, it's no surprise that because the US dollar index has been facing resistance, Bitcoin has had the ability to start pulling away, but we do likely need to see a prolonged drop in the US dollar index if we're going to have that Bitcoin mania phase, and we haven't seen that big drop in the US dollar index quite yet. So I wouldn't be surprised if Bitcoin was able to slowly grind higher here, but I really want to see the US dollar index roll over aggressively if we're going to see a true mania phase for Bitcoin alongside a large alt season like what everybody has been waiting for. But we do know that global liquidity will increase eventually, especially with places like China announcing all of these huge stimulus packages and all of the upcoming monetary debasement. It's only a matter of time before central banks around the world start easing aggressively once again, including the Federal Reserve, even though they haven't started quite yet. We do know that QE will come back eventually, and it's great that we've embarked on this rate cutting cycle, but we need to see that QE step in. We do have that FOMC meeting coming on November 7th, so we'll see what the Fed announces at that FOMC. Rate cuts are great and all, but we want to see that QE get announced to really send Bitcoin into an insane price discovery rally and see that big increase in global liquidity that's required for that to occur. As for traditional markets, we've been seeing some sideways chop for the S&P 500 over the past 2 weeks or so, but it remains in price discovery, which is a great backdrop for Bitcoin, and we'll see if Bitcoin is able to enter price discovery as well and follow in the S&P 500's footsteps. In terms of my strategy, now that Bitcoin is above 70,000, I consider it to be too expensive for me to purchase. It doesn't mean I'm going to sell everything at these prices. It just means that buying is no longer an option for me at these prices, and I'm going to just sit on my existing positions and see how this election ends up playing out and see what ends up happening to all of this open interest and all of this excitement that we're starting to see pouring into the markets, and we'll see how Bitcoin reacts between now and the weekly close. And as of right now, it looks like we were spot on with our claim that it was unlikely that Bitcoin would go back to the low 40,000s. Of course, in this market, anything is possible, and I'm never going to rule out this possibility completely, especially if we see something bad happen to the global economy. But as of right now, it still looks very unlikely that Bitcoin is going to go that low. And if anything, we're probably going to see some chop, maybe some big liquidations to get rid of all this open interest. But as of right now, it's hard to ignore how bullish this price structure is for Bitcoin. And I'm happy that I have the spot holdings that I do to take advantage of this rally and hopefully ride Bitcoin into price discovery. We also do have some huge market moving catalysts on Thursday and on Friday. On Thursday, we have some inflation data with the PCE and core PCE indices. We also have initial jobless claims as always, but the big data print is on Friday, November 1st, when we're going to get an update to the unemployment rate, which tends to have a huge impact on markets, especially when it comes above or below the market expectations going into the reading. So we'll see what ends up happening with that inflation data. Our leading indicator, the trueflation data, does look okay, so I'm not expecting any terrible surprises for PCE. And then similar thing with the unemployment rate. We'll see what the reading ends up being, but we haven't seen any huge warning signs from initial jobless claims or continuing jobless claims quite yet. So we'll see what the data ends up being, but I don't see any huge red flags going into those readings that would make me very concerned that we're going to see some very concerning surprise data prints. But as we look forward, I don't think national deficits are going away anytime soon, and if anything, it looks like the trend is only getting worse because central banks around the world cannot afford for growth to go down when there's this much debt in the economy. And eventually all of that debt has to get monetized and the currency has to be devalued, which is why we remain bullish risk assets like the S&P 500, especially on larger time frames. And of course, it's also why we remain bullish on fixed supply assets like Bitcoin that tend to benefit greatly from monetary inflation and fiat currency debasement. So for now, all we can do is just enjoy this rally and see what happens over the next 1 or 2 weeks with the Fed's decisions, the election outcome, the economic data. It's definitely going to be an exciting November, and everything seems to be aligning for that to be the case. So as always, let me know what you expect. Is this one big trap and is Bitcoin going to crash here? Or is this just the beginning and is Bitcoin going to rally a lot higher? As always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.